Well, let's start with this one. So, have you received any like training in like estimating, and like what was kind of your introduction to estimates?
Just hands-on stuff. There wasn't like any like manual that was given to me. I just worked alongside the CTO for the company that I work for, and
Mhm.
he just kind of taught me how he estimates projects from a technical standpoint.
Yeah, so it's basically just watch me do it,
Yeah.
and here's how we're doing it. And what kind of approach did you take? Like, what approach did you start with then?
It was always about not whatever technical solution was applied, it was always about not digging ourselves into a corner. That was like the most important thing. It was that it's kind of like what not just what works for us right now, but if it like kind of maybe that solution works for us in the
Mm-hmm.
immediate, but is that going to come back and bite us in the butt in the long term?
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I initially wouldn't take into consideration at all. I would just say, well, hey, throw some duct tape on it, you
Mm-hmm.
know.
Mm-hmm.
But he really got me. He really drilled it into me that every decision has a long term consequence, and what may work for
Okay.
you right now in the long term may not work.
So it's not just trying to find the shortest. So this is even talking more about like how do you develop the architecture? How do you plan what you want to do?
Yeah, exactly.
Basically, not to focus on the fastest, easiest solution, but to do the one that'll get results over the next years.
Yeah, and I think that that's actually a very difficult, like that's a very difficult kind of balance to procure because
Mm-hmm.
it really depends on the size of your entity. If you're a smaller entity, the
Mm-hmm.
tendency is, well, we need a solution now. So I think
Yeah.
your team is a little bit on a hotter seat than if you're a bigger entity. You could actually take the time to kind of
Mm-hmm.
look at the landscape and say, okay, well, what's not going to work for us now but in the future. But when you're in a smaller entity, a lot of times it's like, hey, look, we need these solutions to come out as soon as possible. And
Yeah.
I think it makes it very difficult not to corner yourself, for sure,
Mm-hmm.
from a technical standpoint.
It's hard, even if they're in a bigger company. In my experience, that you just end up with these. You plan out like a bigger project, but so many things change, and there's like so many hands
Yep.
like changing things that
So many
even
hands.
then it makes your planning very difficult. Um,
Yep.
so then I'm kind of taking notes, and I'm tabbing over here. So yeah, so you said you just did like hands-on apprenticeship kind of training, not really
Mhm.
totally informal. So I guess here we go. Like what is your standard approach? Let's say you have like a story, or you have like, let's say you have like 5 or 10 stories for a project you want to estimate. Like what is your go-to like approach? Like what do you do?
I think the best thing is to just kind of know where people's limitations are on the team. I think I'll usually reverse engineer it. So if I understand that, hey, it really also depends on like, I mean, you can split this in a million different ways, but I
Mm-hmm.
usually go and leverage if it's a product based solution and there is a developer who has worked in that product before,
Mm-hmm.
then I say, okay, if this is just a different iteration of that product and we're not doing just like a full on new development, then I think that if the developer has already worked on that particular problem, it's best to carry him over to the new iteration of that project because he's going to
Mm-hmm.
be familiar. Doesn't have to, it's going to be the pace at which he can work
Mm-hmm.
is going to be faster.
Okay.
So the point to where you get to that solution is going to be more rapid. I think when you're doing a new project, I mean, I don't know, man. I think that's probably the most difficult question to
Yeah.
ask, in my opinion. Um, because there's so many unknowns, and I feel like like, I mean, like in my team, it seems to me that for as much experience that there is, there's always like a head scratching moment of, hey, like
Mm-hmm.
what's next, right? Especially if you're
Yeah. Yeah.
developing into a new space, which is kind of inherent in the trait. But yeah.
Yeah, typically in software, if it's not a new problem, there's already like a WordPress or like a
Hmm.
Shopify or something. So there's no problem. So it's whether you have a new problem or you have no problem. So it's one of
Yeah,
the fun things.
exactly.
So I guess so here's a question. Like what I just thought of a new question. Like what kind of preparation do you like to see before you do estimates for like the stories? Like what kind of things do you have to like to have figured out before you do that?
I always reverse engineer it from what the client wants. If that's not defined what the client wants, then I always find it kind of useless to get
Mm-hmm.
to starting to build anything, because it's like I always thought about it like a building. It's like if you don't know what you're building,
Mm-hmm.
why are you building it? You know? And
Yeah.
and, and you'd be so and I mean I've seen it in my short experience in the industry that people get to work without actually having the definition of what's being built laid out clearly, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there starts to be this like cross section of communication where people are like, wait, I thought we were doing this, and wait, no, I thought we were doing that, and then all of a
Mm-hmm.
sudden you come to the conclusion, it's like, does anybody actually know what we're building? Which sounds like super basic and kind of weird that that is a problem, but
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
does exist, and I've seen it. So I think it's really important to get that defined, because if you could do that, then you can reverse engineer what you need to do to get to that, what I always call the satisfaction point, which is what the
Mm-hmm.
client desires, right? Keyword what the client desires. But if you don't have that what, you're kind of going to be sitting with a bunch of tools in your hands,
Yeah.
picking at rock.
No, I definitely agree. A lot of people will build things kind of organically, and then you don't really know what you're going to get at the end, and also you don't know
Yeah.
when you're going to get it. Which I can say like it's a bad thing, but it's kind of how a lot of software works because you plan out things, but then the chance of it being what we actually end up with, what ends up working is it's not. It's maybe like half or something.
Yeah.
So what kind of like approaches to estimating have you tried that didn't work?
I think there's like, so Jira has like a point system that we try to allocate, and then try to from like the stuff I've done on Jira, we try to
Hmm.
use a an estimation of capacity via a point system, and I feel like
Hmm.
that did not authentically reflect the capacity of the developers. So that's always really difficult to translate, in particular to the business side, when you
Hmm.
have pieces of your implementation team having to say, hey, look, we have to do this, we have to do that. Who has hands is really the question that ends up coming up a lot, and a lot of
Hmm.
times we don't know. Like there's not a lot of it, especially if you're, really depends on the dynamics of your team too. If you're a full on remote team, it's very
Hmm.
hard to like get a grasp of exactly how much work is actually being done by any given individual at the time, until you get the end result of what you're seeking from that
Hmm.
individual, and you say,
Yeah.
okay, well, he got this and this and that done. But between that space, it's like, you're left to the breadcrumbs on the software that you use, whether it's on Jira, whether it's on Slack. And we've tried to adapt a point system, but then you get to the problem of adherence, like how much people actually
Hmm.
understand what that point system means. If they don't understand, you then have to make sure that you procure the education so that
Hmm.
so that they essentially get with it. And again, I mean, I think some of that's also unique to a startup that does not have a lot of supporting documentation for the processes that
Hmm. Hmm.
are necessary to execute that any given solution. So what we've done to mitigate that issue is that as we build these new processes, instead of just saying, hey, from now on we're going to do this, this, and this, no, everything now has a supporting
Hmm.
documentation. We leverage Confluence a lot for that, or
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
so, and that's like that's super helpful, because you could even backtrack for yourself, because sometimes the nature of the problem can get so complicated, you kind of lose where you're at. But
Hmm.
if you built that paper trail along your decision making process, you could always reference back to it and say, no, actually, that's wrong, this is right, because we do this,
Hmm.
this, and this, and then you
Yeah.
actually have a point to, you essentially start to create a puzzle that you could start to evaluate and solve for your team operationally, right?
Hmm.
um and I focus a lot of my attention on that intersection between how we communicate between the business end of the spectrum, and then just the hardcore development side of the spectrum. So
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. Let me see. What was our next question? Yeah. So what? Okay. So then my next question is like, what do you think is what do you think is stopping your team from producing like better estimates for your stories? Like, what are kind of your things that are blocking you on that?
just getting everybody on the same page. I think there's like another part, like overall, just I think
Mm-hmm.
globally that I don't know how many other teams deal with it, but a big problem is certain developers have very niche based knowledge of the infrastructure as it exists in general.
Mm-hmm.
So whether you do supporting documentation, whether you do better stories, whether you adhere to a point system that is going to help everybody get a better visibility of what's going on, if they are kind of the only keys to the kingdom at the end of the day, the whole team is kind of going to be pending on what's going on with that guy or that those particular individuals, right? So that ends up being like kind of something, I think, a wall that I think we've hit to from like
Mm-hmm.
from a solution standpoint is, okay, well, even if we build this thing out and we get everybody to communicate, if at the end of the day every developer only know there's one developer that knows 100%, almost nearly 100% about how the infrastructure works, and then there's
Mm-hmm.
a bunch of other developers that maybe know a quarter of that
Yeah.
themselves, then nobody really knows what's going on, you know. And I think that is, it goes, I guess it goes deeper than just the software that we use to track the
Mm-hmm.
development of the solutions, into just the people that you work with, for sure. So
Yeah. So it's definitely like different people have different amounts of talent or knowledge about different tasks, and
yeah,
that's a
yeah.
big deal, and that has a big impact on the estimates.
Yeah, exactly. And then the thing is too is that your business team doesn't know that though, right? So they think
Yep.
that any developer can just go in there and like, "Oh, hey, like this is down. Can you go out and check?" Well, actually it turns out that you're actually geographically asking me. I live in the United
Mm-hmm.
States. I work in the United States. Geographically, you're asking me to go and figure out how to first get to Africa, and then
Mm-hmm.
solve the problem that you want me to solve on another continent. So yeah, I could go ahead and do that for you. Sure. Just give me some time. But you know, like that's
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so that intersection is interesting to me for sure.
Yeah. So there's definitely, it seems like there's a sense that we're estimating we're basically introducing a lot of error to our estimates because we're like, some of the approaches are you kind of like treat all the engineers being the same amount of like work done or whatever,
Hmm.
and then you estimate based on that, and then what can happen is depending on who actually gets the task, you can get somebody who's like, this guy's an expert on there and he's working 100%, or you get somebody who's like, he's only got 20%. So what
Yeah.
ends up is now you have like a 5x increase in the inaccuracy of your estimates, actually,
Yep.
because you
Yep.
estimated with one, and then the reality is you got zero point 0.2 and 0.1500 or whatever. So it's
Yep.
like just straight up tanking your estimates, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that was perfectly put.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm probably gonna write an article on that, actually. That's one thing I want to dig into more.
Hmm.
Let's change that. So here, I think this is probably a last question that I've got. I have more questions. So this is probably gonna be our last question. But what's the worst thing that's happened for you or your team when you've had bad estimates?
Man, that's a billion different things, man. A billion different things. I think poorly built software, honestly,
Okay.
poorly built software. Like to your point, every
Hmm.
team learns too. I mean, if you're like a new team that doesn't
Yeah.
really know, it's like a pickup. If especially if the developers don't know how to pass the ball between one another and don't really have that like a
Hmm.
good working vibe together, it's like they could be good individual developers, but collectively when you aggregate them into a team, they might not actually be able to produce the solution that you're looking for.
Mm.
Especially if there's not an environment. I noticed that if there's not an environment where the developers are actually helpful to one another and they keep very siloed in their base of knowledge,
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
usually makes a very ineffective team, because
Yeah.
they don't have to be socialites. But it's like if you hit a guy up in Slack and you're like, hey, look, I'm struggling with this puzzle that you particularly on this team
Hmm.
are the
Hmm.
most expert on, and if I and there's a deadline on this puzzle, right, and you don't get back to me
Hmm.
within a 24-hour time period, especially for the remote teams, they're like,
Yeah.
okay, well then, and there's no supporting documentation, then there, from a teammate perspective, that dude, he messed up, right? So he
Hmm.
messed up. So either way, so to your original question, I think the poor estimations and all that stuff, like it ends up resulting in poorly built software when
Mhm.
everything is said and done. If I'm gonna make it succinct and to the point, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Just because people are rushing and not communicating. Um,
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
okay.
And like you said, and what you had said, Nick, was I thought was a very good point. Is you got so many hands on it, you know, so in very intricate little pieces.
Mhm,
All
mhm.
right. So if everybody's not kind of on the same boat, or not kind of, if they're not on the same boat about who's touching what and why that thing is being touched to get to what point,
Yep.
then there's going to be, it just becomes a mess. Honestly, it
Yeah,
becomes a
yeah, for
mess. Is
sure.
what.
Nice. Yeah, so that's actually all my questions. Just wanted to thank you for talking to me, Alvaro. It's been great. I want to keep these kind of short and succinct.